One day, my son and daughter-in-law vanished without a single trace. 9 months later, I discovered my grandson had been born in a distant hospital. But no matter how hard I tried to reach them, they avoided me, erasing me completely from their lives. I was powerless, but I refused to surrender. They needed to learn that this old mother is not someone to be pushed aside so easily. Are you curious to know what really happened? Then stay with me in today's video, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this story. Tell me where you're listening from, my dear viewers, because this is our story. When I unlocked my front door that afternoon, the air inside still smelled faintly of lavender and old books exactly as I'd left it. My trip to Italy had been a dream, a gift I promised myself after decades of night shifts and hospital corridors. I carried home olive oil Murano glass and a silk scarf for my daughter-in-law, Lauren. But as I looked across the street toward my son's house, a chill crept up my spine. The curtains were drawn tight. The mailbox overflowed with letters and unpaid bills. Even the flower pots by the porch had dried out completely. Matthew's car wasn't in the driveway, neither was Lauren's. For a moment, I told myself they must have gone away for the weekend, maybe visiting friends. But the longer I stood there, the more the silence pressed against me. I called his phone. Straight to voicemail. Lauren's, too. I knocked on their door, half expecting the sound of their golden retriever barking, but only the wind answered. Inside my chest, an old instinct stirred the same unease I used to feel before a patient coded. Something was off. I walked around the house, noticing small things: a package soaked by the rain newspapers from 3 weeks ago, no sign of trash bins being moved. My heart started to race. Matthew never let things pile up like this. He was meticulous, always calling to remind me about bills or grocery deliveries. I sat down on the porch step, clutching the silk scarf I'd bought for Lauren. The fabric slipped through my fingers like cold water. 5 years of retirement had softened me, but that old diagnostic mind was still sharp. Missing mail, empty driveway, dead phone lines, no forwarding address. I whispered to myself, "It doesn't feel like a vacation. It feels like an emergency." That night I couldn't sleep. The silence of the neighborhood felt heavier than usual, almost rehearsed. I stared across the street at their dark windows, and for the first time since my husband died, I felt the ache of real fear. My medical training taught me to stay calm, to gather data before conclusions. But this wasn't a hospital. This was my family. And as the wind howled outside, one thought looped in my mind like a diagnosis I didn't want to make. Something terrible had happened here. The next morning, I must have called Matthew 20 times. Each time the line rang twice, then cut off with that sharp click I knew too well. Not a technical failure, no, it was deliberate. I tried Lauren's number too, but it went straight to voicemail, her cheerful recording sounding almost cruel now. By noon, I couldn't sit still anymore. I grabbed my car keys and drove to their house on Sycamore Street. When I pulled up, I felt my chest tighten. The windows were bare, the curtains gone. The porch looked scrubbed clean, as if someone had tried to erase every sign of life. Through the glass, I saw empty floors where furniture used to be. The nursery that once smelled of baby powder and soft light now held nothing but dust and echoes. The crib, the rocking chair, even the mobile above it all gone. I pressed my palm to the cold window, my reflection trembling against it. On the front gate, a bright red sign read, "For rent. Contact Angela Realty." My throat went dry. I called the number, forcing my voice to stay steady. A woman answered, polite but detached. She said the house had been listed 2 weeks ago and already rented under a different name. She couldn't share the details, she added, for privacy reasons. I thanked her, though I could barely speak. When I hung up, my hand was shaking. Inside the empty house, dust motes floated in the sunlight like tiny ghosts. I stood in the center of the living room, my suitcase still in hand, and whispered to the walls. They erased themselves completely. Every trace, every memory gone. A week passed. I tried to send the gifts I'd brought from Italy, a silk scarf, a leather wallet, a small toy violin for my grandson. Each package came back with the same brutal stamp, return to sender. I went to Lauren's old workplace at Wells Fargo, hoping maybe someone there had her forwarding address. The young teller looked up her name, then said quietly that Lauren had resigned a month ago and left no contact information. That night, I sat at the dining table surrounded by unopened envelopes and returned parcels. The silence was unbearable. I used to think the worst pain for a mother was losing a child to death. But this being erased from their lives felt worse. It was as if I'd been declared dead while still breathing. I traced the words on the last envelope. Return to sender. The ink smudged slightly from my thumb. The phrase felt like a verdict, not just from the post office, but from my own son. In a country that protects privacy so fiercely, even a mother can vanish from her own family's world. And in that moment, surrounded by all that was returned, I realized that I wasn't just alone. I had been deleted. It was raining hard that night, the kind of cold rain that made the air taste like metal. I was sitting by the window with a cup of tea gone lukewarm when I heard a firm, deliberate knock on the door. Not the kind that came from a lost neighbor or a delivery. It was the kind that carried purpose, maybe even guilt. I hesitated for a moment, the house silent except for the wind pressing against the windows. Then I stood up and opened the door. A man stood there, maybe in his early 60s, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He held it in both hands, his coat damp and his eyes darting between me and the floor. The porch light threw a soft amber glow over his face, revealing deep lines around his mouth, the kind that come from regret more than age. "Are you Rachel Nolan?" he asked quietly. I nodded, keeping my hand on the doorframe. "My name is Patrick Vaughn," he continued. "I'm Lauren's stepfather." I froze. The name hit me like a slow echo. Patrick Vaughn. I'd seen it once years ago, scribbled on an old wedding invitation that Lauren never mailed. I had no reason to remember it until now. I stepped aside slightly enough for him to see I was listening, but not enough to invite him in. He shifted his hat between his fingers, voice trembling just enough to betray the weight of what he carried. "I wouldn't have come if it wasn't serious. But I know why your son and Lauren disappeared." For a second, all I could hear was the rain hitting the roof. My throat tightened. "You know where they are?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "Not exactly. But I know who made them leave. And it wasn't their choice." My heart pounded. "Who?" Patrick's eyes met mine, and for a moment his expression softened, almost pitying. "Your ex-husband," he said, each word heavy and precise. "He's the one behind all of this." The world seemed to tilt for a moment. The smell of wet earth drifted in from outside. My ex-husband, gone from my life for decades now, somehow tied to my son's disappearance. I didn't move. The porch light flickered once, then steadied. Patrick stood there, rain dripping from his coat, waiting for me to speak. But I couldn't. My hands trembled, and I felt the air leave my chest. Then something inside me hardened. Whatever grief I'd been drowning in it started to shift into something colder, clearer. I lifted my chin, looked him in the eye, and said softly, "Come in. Tell me everything." I used to believe that discipline could fix anything. As a physician, I had trained myself to see the world through clear lines: symptoms, causes, treatments. Logic, order, recovery. But life has a way of breaking even the most methodical people. After 40 years of practicing internal medicine at Cleveland Clinic, I retired earlier than planned when my heart began to protest the long shifts. The doctors called it a minor arrhythmia, but I knew better. It was exhaustion, the kind that comes from holding everyone else together for too long. My house in the suburbs of Cleveland is modest, but comfortable, fully paid off. I live alone now, surrounded by books, old medical journals, and the ticking of a grandfather clock that once belonged to my father. My finances are solid, a steady pension, and several savings accounts that I keep more organized than my spice rack. There's also the life insurance policy from Austin, my ex-husband, the man who vanished from my life 25 years ago, yet still manages to cast a shadow through paperwork and memory. Austin was charming, reckless, and brilliant in a way that could make you forget your better judgment. When he left me for a woman half his age, Matthew was only 6. I remember that night vividly, my son asking if his father was coming home, and me pretending to believe he might. From that day on, I became both parent and provider. Every school uniform, every field trip, every medical bill, I paid for them all. I worked extra shifts, took teaching positions, and kept our little world intact through sheer endurance. When Matthew grew up, I helped him pay for his MBA, proud that he was finally stepping into the kind of life I had always dreamed for him. I even put a down payment on the house he and Lauren bought after their wedding. People often called me lucky, financially secure, still healthy, independent. But beneath the order and the calm, there's a scar I never talk about. Being betrayed by someone you once built your life around leaves a hollow that no savings account can fill. Sometimes at night, when the neighborhood quiets down, I catch myself listening for sounds that no longer exist. A child's laughter, the hum of another heartbeat beside mine. I tell myself I've survived worse, that I'm too rational for sentiment. Yet the truth is, no degree, no pension, no discipline ever fully heals the wound of abandonment. I built a life on stability, but part of me has never stopped waiting for an explanation that never came. Lauren came into our family. She was the kind of woman people described as perfect, always polished, always composed. Her voice was gentle, her posture confident, her smile the kind that could win anyone's trust. She worked at the Wells Fargo branch in Cleveland Heights, managing corporate accounts and greeting clients with professional warmth. To the outside world, she was everything a modern woman should be: smart, capable, respectable. When she married my son Matthew in the spring of 2020, during the height of the pandemic, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The ceremony was small, held in our backyard under soft string lights. I remember standing by the lilac bushes watching Matthew slip the ring on her finger while I thought to myself, finally, my son is happy. The world was falling apart outside our fence, but in that moment, our little family felt safe, intact. But as the months passed, subtle changes began to surface. Lauren, with her soft tone and careful manners, slowly became the one who made every decision about money. She took charge of their joint account for convenience, she said. She managed their mortgage, their bills, even their grocery budget. When Matthew mentioned buying new office equipment, she gently reminded him to let her handle the details. I noticed he started asking her permission before spending anything. It was as if the woman I once saw as nurturing had quietly built an invisible cage around my son, and he didn't even realize he was inside it. Then there were the credit cards. I found out Lauren had opened several under Matthew's name, but they required her co-signature for any transaction. When I asked Matthew about it, he laughed it off, saying Mom Lauren just likes things organized. Still, something about that explanation didn't sit right. They tried to have children for years with no success. I watched Lauren cry during family dinners, apologizing to Matthew for failing him. My heart ached for her. I even took them to a fertility clinic once, sitting in the waiting room as they filled out forms, hoping science could give them what nature hadn't. But as time passed, I began to notice the small cracks in her sorrow, the way her eyes darted too quickly when she spoke of treatments, the way her hand tightened around Matthew's arm whenever I mentioned family. Her sadness felt rehearsed, her tears too perfect. There was something about Lauren's smile that unsettled me. It was warm, polite, yet distant, like a curtain drawn just enough to let in light but not enough to reveal what lay behind it. I couldn't explain it then, but deep down I knew that smile was hiding something far colder than loneliness. A month before my trip to Italy, I started noticing small changes, quiet ones that only a mother could sense. Lauren had become distant, her warmth replaced by polite indifference. She avoided eye contact during dinner, laughed at nothing, and always seemed to have one foot out the door. I told myself it was work stress. She'd been at Wells Fargo for years, and internal audits always made her edgy. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about work. One evening, during what should have been a simple family dinner, I made the mistake of asking what most mothers eventually ask. I smiled and said lightly, "Have you two thought about having a baby? I could help if you need support." The words had barely left my mouth when Lauren's fork clattered against her plate. She stood up so suddenly, her chair scraped the floor. "I don't want to talk about that," she said. Her tone clipped her face pale. Matthew froze, glancing between us like a man trapped between two worlds. The silence that followed was long and heavy. She excused herself, saying she had early meetings, and left before dessert. After that night, things changed completely. Lauren stopped coming over. When I called, she'd reply with short messages about work deadlines or not feeling well. Matthew grew quieter too. He visited less often, and when he did, he looked tired, distracted, and older somehow. The last time I pressed him, he only said, "Lauren's been under a lot of stress, Mom. Please don't ask her anything right now." It was the first time he'd ever sounded defensive with me. That's when I noticed something else, small but unmistakable. A bank notification appeared on my phone showing that Matthew had made several quiet withdrawals from the shared savings account we used to manage his mortgage. Normally, he would tell me before moving a cent. This time, nothing. No explanation, no call. I didn't want to believe it meant anything, but my instinct as both a doctor and a mother whispered, otherwise, something was very wrong. A week before I left for Italy, Lauren showed up unexpectedly, holding a box of pastries from her favorite bakery. She looked polished, as always, but her smile was too careful, her eyes distant. We sat in the kitchen, the pastries untouched between us. She said she'd heard about my trip and thought it was wonderful. Then she added, "You should really take time to rest, Rachel. Go somewhere far. Stay as long as you can. You need peace, don't you?" Her voice was soft, almost kind, but it carried a strange weight, like a goodbye disguised as concern. When she left, the kitchen felt colder, emptier, as if she'd taken something invisible with her. I stood by the window long after her car disappeared, the untouched pastries still on the table, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't come to wish me well. She had come to make sure I went away. I was in Florence when the email came. It was from Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor across the street, an early riser who noticed everything. Her message was short, but unsettling. "Rachel, dear, there was a moving truck outside Matthew's house all morning. Looked like they were clearing everything out. Then around noon they left. No forwarding address on the mailbox. Thought you should know." I read it twice then, a third time the espresso cooling beside me. My first reaction was confusion. Maybe they'd sold the house. Maybe it was temporary. But the more I thought about it, the more the details gnawed at me. No one moves out on a weekday morning without notice. No one vanishes without telling their mother. I sent Matthew a quick message. "What's going on, sweetheart? Mrs. Henderson said she saw movers. Is everything okay?" Hours passed. Then my phone buzzed. One text. "I need time alone, Mom. Please don't look for me." That was all. No punctuation, no warmth, just that. The message felt mechanical, like it wasn't even written by him. I tried calling immediately, but the number was already disconnected. Lauren's, too. Their social media accounts, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, were gone, profiles wiped clean like they never existed. Every email I sent bounced back with that cold phrase, "Delivery failed." It was as if my own son had erased himself from the world. Panic started to build, but my training as a doctor kicked in. I had learned to steady my hands even when blood ran down them. I told myself to gather facts first. I called Matthew's workplace, a software company downtown Cleveland. The HR manager, a polite young woman, checked her screen and said, "He resigned last week. No notice, no reason given." Her tone was kind, but the pause that followed told me she thought the same thing I did. Something wasn't right. That night, back in my hotel room, I stared at the glowing city outside my window. The beauty of Florence, suddenly meaningless. My son had always been meticulous, predictable, steady. He paid bills on time, filed taxes early, and never made impulsive choices. The behavior didn't fit. Then I remembered something from years of hospital work: patients who disappeared after a crisis, or criminals who fled before exposure. There was a certain pattern: sudden withdrawal, cutting all ties, burning the trail behind them. It wasn't escape. It was evasion. My hands trembled slightly as I closed my laptop. I whispered into the quiet room, "You're not just taking time, Matthew. You're hiding." And deep down, I knew whatever he was running from wasn't simple shame or exhaustion. It was something darker, something planned. It was an ordinary afternoon when I got the call that changed everything. Dr. Melissa Chen, one of my former residents from Cleveland Clinic, now an obstetrician at St. Luke's Medical Center in North Carolina, called with a hesitant tone I immediately recognized. She said she had come across something unusual: a patient named Lauren N. Vaughn, who looked exactly like the woman in the wedding photo I once showed her, the one with my son Matthew, smiling beside her. Melissa spoke carefully, as doctors do when they know their words could wound. "Rachel, I might be wrong," she said, "but this woman, she gave birth here 2 weeks ago, a baby boy. The record says 6.8 pounds, healthy, delivered by C-section. The notes mention in vitro fertilization." I sat in silence, the world tilting slightly around me. IVF. A birth. A baby boy, I whispered. The last name Vaughn. That's not her maiden name. Melissa hesitated, then said softly, "I know. That's why I called." She couldn't legally give me the full chart, of course. The HIPAA privacy law protects patient information even from family. But she read one detail that hit me like a knife: the infant's name, Brandon Nolan. My name. My son's name. And yet, under next of kin, the space was left blank. No mother-in-law, no grandparents, not even Matthew's name listed as an emergency contact. When I requested a temporary birth certificate, the hospital administration declined, citing confidentiality. I thanked them politely before hanging up, my voice steady, but my hands trembling. For the first time, I truly felt what it meant to be erased. Lauren hadn't just hidden a pregnancy. She had erased our family line from the record entirely. She'd used her stepfather's surname, cut off every link to the Nolans, and given birth under an identity designed to exclude me. That wasn't stress or coincidence, it was a deliberate act of removal. I stood by my desk for a long time, looking at the faded ultrasound photo Matthew once sent me years ago, before everything went wrong. My son had wanted a child so badly. And now that child existed somewhere out there, born under a false name, his connection to me wiped clean like a deleted file. I felt the old instinct rising again, the same one that used to push me through long surgeries and late-night emergencies. When faced with the unknown, you don't cry. You investigate. You gather data. You cut through layers until you find the truth. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote on the first page, "Case study: the disappearance of Matthew and Lauren Nolan." Subject focus infant, Brandon Nolan, alias. I underlined it twice, the ink pressing deep into the paper. If Lauren wanted to sever me from my own blood, she had underestimated me. I wasn't just a retired doctor anymore. I was about to perform the most personal investigation of my life. For the first few days, I told myself it was just a misunderstanding. People get busy. Phones break. Messages get lost. But as the days turned into weeks, that comforting logic began to crumble. I called Matthew's number over and over again, 43 times to be exact. Each call ended the same way, a few rings, then silence, then the cruel flicker of number blocked on the screen. One afternoon, out of desperation, I borrowed my neighbor's phone. When Lauren answered, there was a brief pause, 3 seconds of quiet, so sharp I could hear her breathing. Then the line went dead. She hadn't said a single word. That silence told me more than any argument could have. It wasn't an accident. It was rejection. I sat at my writing desk that evening, the one by the window overlooking the small maple tree Matthew planted when he was 10. I took out my stationery ivory paper blue ink and began a letter. My handwriting trembled slightly, but the words came easily. Dear Matthew and Lauren, I just want to know that you're safe. Whatever's happening, you still have a home here. Love, Mom. I sealed it carefully, pressed the envelope flat with my hand, and sent it the next morning. A week later, it came back unopened. Across the front, stamped in stark black ink, were 2 words, recipient unknown. I stared at them for a long time as if willing them to change. They didn't. Soon, more letters followed the same path, sent with hope, returned with silence. I stacked them neatly at first, then less carefully until they spilled across the table like fallen leaves. I remember standing there, one envelope slipping from my hand and floating to the floor, then another and another, until the whole pile scattered. The sound of paper hitting the wood was softer than I expected, almost mournful. That night, I sat by the fireplace watching the flames flicker against the brass grate. I replayed every memory: Matthew's graduation, his wedding day, the way he used to call me every Sunday morning just to ask if I'd had breakfast. How does a son vanish like that? How does love go from constant to absent? I whispered to myself, half in disbelief, half in pain. Is he being forced? Or is he choosing to erase me? That question echoed inside me louder than the ticking clock on the mantel. It was the first time I allowed myself to admit that something darker might be happening. That this wasn't about distance or pride. It was about disappearance. And I knew in that moment that I couldn't stop searching no matter where the truth led. I thought sending a gift might open a small door between us again, something gentle, something maternal. $2,000, just enough for diapers formula or a crib. I typed the note carefully into the Wells Fargo transfer field for baby's care. It felt like a small bridge of love crossing a growing distance. But 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a cold notification. Transfer reversed, account closed. I stared at the screen for a long time, unsure whether to feel shocked or foolish. Out of habit, I called the Wells Fargo branch Lauren used to work at. The woman on the phone sounded polite, but detached, her tone as dry as a hospital report. I'm sorry, ma'am. The account holder has withdrawn all remaining funds and closed her profile. No forwarding address was provided. I asked, perhaps too quickly, if they could at least confirm she was safe. The silence that followed said everything. Then came the line I dreaded most. I'm afraid we can't disclose any further information. It's protected under federal privacy law. Legal, correct, cold. I hung up and opened my laptop, logging into the shared savings account Matthew and I once used years ago when he was just starting his first job. I hadn't checked it in months, but the familiar numbers greeted me like an old photograph, or at least they should have. The balance read $0. I scrolled through the transaction history, my pulse quickening. There it was, 1 week before my flight to Italy. Withdrawal $45,000. Matthew's name next to it. The entire account emptied in one move. For a long time, I just sat there, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. My hands rested on the printout, fingertips smudging the ink slightly. That money wasn't about the amount. It was about trust. A trust built over decades, erased in seconds. I could feel my medical instincts waking again, the habit of diagnosing not just illness, but intent. I knew the patterns of panic, the behaviors of those cornered by guilt or fear. Patients who lied about pain, colleagues who covered up mistakes. The same signs were here in numbers and transactions instead of words. I whispered to the empty room. People don't close their accounts, withdraw everything and disappear unless they're hiding something. Outside, the wind rustled the maple leaves brushing against the window pane. Somewhere in that sound, I felt the thin edge between heartbreak and clarity. Whatever Matthew and Lauren were running from, it wasn't just family tension. It was something deeper, something that smelled like danger. And as I folded the bank statement and placed it in my notebook, I understood that what began as concern had now become an investigation. When I realized I could no longer find answers through messages or memories, I called the only person I knew who could help me without judgment. Cameron Ellis. We'd met in medical school decades ago. He'd studied criminal law before switching to investigative work. Over the years, he'd gone from private detective to one of the sharpest criminal attorneys in Columbus. If there was anyone who could find truth without crossing the line, it was Cameron. He picked up on the first ring, his voice calm and familiar. "Rachel, you sound like you haven't slept in days." "I haven't," I admitted. "They're gone, Cameron. Completely. Phones dead, accounts closed. I don't know if they're hiding or being hidden." He didn't ask unnecessary questions. That was his way. "Send me whatever information you have. Their full names, last known addresses, workplaces. I'll see what I can pull from public records." Cameron knew how to navigate the Freedom of Information Act better than anyone I knew. He could access legal filings, employment records, and financial disclosures all within the law. Within a week, he called back. The tone in his voice was different this time, lower, cautious. "I've got something, Rachel," he said. "Matthew resigned from Evermark Tech about 2 months before you came home. No reason listed. He didn't apply for unemployment benefits, didn't request references, and didn't provide a forwarding address. HR marked his file as voluntary termination. That's not normal." I felt my heart sink, and Lauren, he exhaled. "She filed for early maternity leave 3 months before giving birth, but kept collecting temporary salary advances. The payments were rerouted to a P.O. box in North Carolina, labeled as temporary." "I don't like it, Rachel. That kind of setup shows up in financial fraud cases, money laundering, debt evasion, sometimes identity manipulation." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I stared at the fireplace, where the last of the logs had burned down to ash. Why would they need to hide? They had everything. "That's the thing," Cameron said quietly. "If they stopped talking to you because they were ashamed, that's one thing. People do foolish things out of pride. But if someone told them to cut contact, someone controlling their movements or their money, then it's not just shame, Rachel. It's manipulation. And you need to be careful." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone. "You think they're in trouble?" "I think," he said slowly, "they're not acting on their own." When the call ended, I sat there in silence, the sound of the rain beginning again outside. My pulse steadied, not with calm, but with clarity. This wasn't just disappearance anymore. It was orchestration. Someone had rewritten my family's story, and I was going to find out who. It took me almost 9 hours behind the wheel to reach Raleigh. The sky shifted from pale gray to soft gold as I crossed state lines, but I barely noticed. Every mile felt like a countdown. Every gas station stop a delay I could hardly bear. I told myself I was simply visiting an old colleague, but the truth was heavier. I was going there to confirm what my heart already feared, that Lauren had given birth in secret, and someone had helped her hide it. St. Luke's Medical Center looked just as I remembered it from conferences years ago: modern glass walls, trimmed hedges, and the quiet hum of order. I parked far from the main entrance, adjusted my scarf, and walked in slowly, carrying an old file to look the part. When the receptionist asked, I smiled. "I'm here to see Dr. Elisa Moore, old colleagues from Cleveland Clinic." The name still carried weight enough for a polite nod and a visitor badge. Elisa recognized me instantly when I entered her office. Time had given her silver streaks in her hair, but her warmth was unchanged. "Rachel Nolan," she said softly. "You look exactly the same. What brings you here?" "I'm trying to confirm something," I said, lowering my voice. "A patient named Lauren Vaughn. She gave birth here earlier this year, C-section." Her expression shifted. She leaned back slowly, searching my face. "You mean Lauren Donovan?" "Yes," I whispered. Elisa hesitated, then turned her monitor slightly toward me. "You didn't hear this from me," she said. "But yes, she was here. Healthy baby boy. But something's off." She began typing, scrolling through records. Her file has been edited manually. The spouse field was deleted. The maternal information was changed from Donovan to Vaughn. It's been overwritten, not updated. See. I leaned closer, my heart pounding, as I read the faint log notes at the bottom of the screen. Access level administrative override. Elisa's voice was careful. "Whoever did this had high-level clearance. That's not something a patient or even most doctors can do. We're talking about someone in administration or financial compliance. Someone who knows how to make edits invisible." I swallowed hard. So Lauren didn't do this herself. She shook her head. "No chance. This was deliberate." She glanced toward the hallway, then closed the screen. "Rachel, be careful. If someone's willing to alter medical records, they're protecting something bigger than privacy." I left the hospital as the sun dipped behind the parking lot. The glass windows reflected streaks of orange like fire behind a mask. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, my mind racing. Someone powerful had erased the truth from official records, and for the first time I knew beyond doubt that this wasn't just family conflict. It was a cover-up. It was a quiet evening, the kind that feels heavier than silence itself. Rain brushed lightly against the windows, and I was sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by printouts, bank statements, transaction maps, and scribbled notes connecting names to dates. My eyes burned from hours of staring at numbers that refused to make sense. That's when I heard a knock. 3 times. Slow, deliberate, uncertain. For a moment, I didn't move. No one ever came by unannounced anymore. The second set of knocks was softer, almost apologetic. I stood, my pulse rising, and opened the door. A tall man stood on my porch, rain dripping from his coat collar. He was in his early 60s, with gray hair combed back and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and slept too little. He held his hat in both hands, as if unsure whether to enter. "Mrs. Nolan?" he asked gently. "Yes," I said, studying him. "Can I help you?" He nodded once. "My name is Patrick Vaughn. I was Lauren's stepfather. Her mother and I were married before she passed away." The name hit me like a jolt. Patrick Vaughn. I'd seen it before on the transaction records from Lauren's Wells Fargo account. The initials, P. Vaughn had appeared more than once in the column for incoming transfers. At the time, I assumed it was a distant relative. But now, standing in front of me, was the man behind that name. He looked exhausted. "I've been trying to reach Lauren for months," he said, voice cracking slightly. She stopped answering my calls, blocked my number. I thought maybe it was just family tension. But now I think she's hiding something. Something serious. I motioned for him to come in. He hesitated, then stepped onto the mat, wiping his shoes carefully, the way polite men of his generation do. The scent of wet wool filled the room as he sat down across from me. "I saw you once," he said quietly, "in a photo at their wedding. You were smiling, holding Matthew's arm." Lauren kept that picture on her shelf for years. He gave a faint, sad smile. Then suddenly, it was gone. I tried to steady my voice. "What kind of contact did you have with her recently?" "None," he said. "But I know money was being moved. Someone was sending her large deposits, amounts too high for her salary. I checked with a friend in finance." My stomach tightened. "And those transfers came from you?" He shook his head slowly. "No. I think they were made in my name." I felt the blood drain from my face. That same name, P. Vaughn, the one I'd seen linked to Lauren's bank activity. My thoughts raced, connecting fragments that suddenly fit too well. As the rain deepened outside, I realized this man hadn't just brought me information. He'd brought me proof that whatever had happened to Matthew and Lauren wasn't just personal. It was orchestrated. Someone was using names, money, and records to build a web around my family, and Patrick Vaughn had just walked into my home holding one of its threads. Back to now. My daughter-in-law's stepfather. Patrick sat across from me, the lamplight casting deep shadows under his eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he held the mug of coffee I'd given him, though the coffee had long gone cold. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, weighted, not just by exhaustion, but by years of shame. "I never thought I'd have to say this to you, Rachel," he began. "But I've known your ex-husband before, Austin Nolan." The sound of that name felt like a slap. For years, I'd trained myself not to react to it, not to give the past that kind of power. But hearing it from Patrick in that tone reopened a wound I thought had long scarred over. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "About 15 years ago, I invested in a company called Nolan Capital Group. Austin ran it himself, charming, confident, talking about guaranteed 20% annual returns. He looked me in the eye and said, 'You'll double your savings in 5 years.' And I believed him. I listened without interrupting, though my throat had gone dry. For a while, everything seemed legitimate." Patrick continued. "Monthly statements, small payouts, glossy reports. Then one day, the emails stopped. The website vanished. The office building downtown was empty, and Austin, your husband, was gone, along with every dollar I had. He wiped out my retirement, my savings, even the mortgage I'd put up for collateral." He paused, staring into the coffee like he could still see the numbers vanishing from his account. "I lost everything. My marriage didn't survive it either. Lauren's mother blamed me. We divorced 2 years later. She died of a stroke not long after that." Silence hung between us, broken only by the ticking of the old wall clock. I wanted to feel sympathy, but something in my chest tightened, an echo of betrayal I'd buried decades ago. Patrick's tone hardened. 3 years ago, I started seeing his name again, not directly, just whispers online. A man calling himself A. Nolan, running an investment consultancy called A. Nolan Investments. The style was identical. Polished website, fake testimonials, promising impossible returns through cryptocurrency portfolios. My pulse quickened. "You're saying Austin's alive?" He nodded grimly. "Alive and still doing what he does best, stealing under the guise of opportunity." I dug deeper. The digital trails lead to multiple shell accounts, fake investors, and a few names that kept repeating. He looked up at me, eyes glassy. "One of them was Lauren. The other was your son, Matthew." The air left my lungs. The papers on the table blurred. Patrick's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're part of it, Rachel. Whether willingly or not, they're tied to Austin's operation. He's rebuilt his empire, and your family is inside it." Outside, the rain began again, steady and relentless, like a truth that refused to be ignored. Patrick's voice dropped to almost a whisper, the kind that forces you to lean in just to catch the words. His eyes darted toward the window, as if afraid someone might be listening. "Rachel!" he said, his tone trembling with both guilt and urgency. "There's something you need to know. Your son and daughter-in-law didn't just disappear. They're working for Austin." For a moment, I couldn't process what he'd said. The name, the connection felt like a physical blow. "That's impossible," I managed to say, though the words barely escaped my throat. "Matthew would never." Patrick shook his head. "I wish that were true." He reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a folder, the paper edges frayed from too much handling. He laid them on the table, one by one, printed emails, bank records, screenshots of transaction logs. "Look here," he said, pointing to a timestamp. "This email came from an encrypted server the same day Matthew closed his joint savings account. The $45,000 withdrawal was transferred within hours to a shell company under A. Nolan Holdings. That's your ex-husband's current alias." I stared at the documents, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. The numbers, the signatures, the timeline, it all fit too perfectly. Patrick continued, his voice rough with regret. "Austin recruited them months ago. He promised them financial help for IVF treatments. That's how he baited them. Said he'd cover the full cost if they helped him create fake investor profiles and launder funds through small crypto accounts. It was all under the guise of a tech startup, but the whole operation is a fraud." I pressed a trembling hand to my mouth. "So, they cut contact with me because Austin told them to." Patrick finished quietly. "He knew you'd notice something wrong. You were the one person who could trace his movements. He told them to disappear to make it look like a family falling out. That way, if anyone started asking questions, it would just look like private drama, not a financial crime." I felt the air leave my lungs as the truth settled in. Every unanswered call, every returned letter, every closed account. It wasn't rejection. It was containment, a cover story. Patrick looked down, unable to meet my eyes. "I don't think they realize how deep they are. Austin's using them as fronts. If this blows up, they'll be the ones holding the blame, not him." My hands tightened into fists. The pain that once felt like heartbreak was morphing into something colder clarity. "He destroyed my family," once I said quietly, my voice steadier than I expected. "And now he's doing it again through my own child." The rain outside grew heavier, streaking down the glass like ink. I looked at the stack of evidence between us. Each page, a piece of the puzzle I never wanted to solve. The realization was brutal but undeniable. This wasn't abandonment. It was manipulation crafted by the man who had already stolen everything from me once. And this time, I wouldn't let him finish the job. Patrick spread the documents across my kitchen table like a man laying out a confession. The papers were damp at the corners from the rain, but the print was clear rows of numbers, digital trails, email headers. Each sheet was another piece of truth I had prayed I would never see. "These," he said softly, his hands trembling slightly, "are copies of the leaked emails Lauren sent from her private account. Someone in an online investors group forwarded them to me thinking they were marketing material. But they're not. They're proof." I leaned in. My eyes swept over the first-page bank statements, wire transfers, payment confirmations. The names leapt out at me like ghosts from the past. A. Nolan Holdings, LLC, Donovan Consulting. Patrick pointed to one highlighted line on a transfer record. $50,000, he said. From Austin's company to Lauren's consulting firm. The business was registered under her maiden name, opened for 3 months, then quietly dissolved. No clients, no activity except these payments. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. I flipped through the next few pages, more transactions, more encrypted notes. One email thread read, "Confirm the next phase once wire clears. Use separate wallets for BTC dispersal." I didn't need to be a lawyer to know what that meant. Patrick slid another printout toward me. It showed a series of cryptocurrency wallet addresses, each one cross-referenced with a blockchain record. He had circled one in red ink. "This wallet," he said quietly, "belongs to Austin. I verified it with a friend in financial crimes. It's the same address used in multiple fraud cases overseas." My pulse thundered in my ears. So Matthew and Lauren were helping him move the money. Patrick nodded. "They probably don't even know the full scale. Austin funds their expenses, makes it look like legitimate work remote consulting digital assets. But what they're doing is laundering money across state and international lines. That's federal. Wire fraud. Interstate transfer. Once the feds trace the origin, they'll go down with him." I pressed a hand to my forehead. My son's name printed beside fake invoices and shell corporations blurred through my tears. The child I raised, the boy who once spent Saturdays fixing up his old bicycle with me, now tangled in his father's crimes. Patrick's voice trembled. "I was one of Austin's victims, Rachel. He drained me dry, left me ruined. You were his wife. You know what kind of man he is, and now—" He hesitated, his eyes wet but unflinching. "Your son is the next tool in his scheme." The clock ticked in the silence that followed. I looked down at the papers, the cold black ink, spelling out betrayal in numbers and signatures. For years I'd tried to believe Austin's ghost couldn't touch me anymore. But here he was again, reaching through digital wires resurrected in fraud and deceit, using my own flesh and blood as his new disguise. And in that moment, I understood this wasn't just about family. This was about justice. I sat frozen for a long time, the sound of rain outside fading into a distant murmur. In front of me was the truth. I had been running from a bank statement stamped A. Nolan Holdings, signed in that same tilted handwriting I once knew better than my own. That signature. I had seen it on medical prescriptions when we still shared a clinic on grocery bills we used to split on the divorce papers that ended everything. The ink on this page was fresh, but the hand that wrote it hadn't changed. Austin. My breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. 30 years ago, he had walked out of our Cleveland house with one suitcase and a letter that said, "I need to find my freedom." I remember standing in the doorway, reading those words again and again until the ink blurred from my tears. I had convinced myself that freedom meant redemption, maybe a chance for him to start over. But now I understood what his freedom truly was: a life built on deceit, greed, and the destruction of everyone who ever loved him. And now he had dragged our son into it. I didn't cry loudly. The tears came quietly sliding down my cheeks as I stared at the signature. My voice, when I finally spoke, sounded strange to my own ears, steady, cold, like someone who had outgrown fear. "When people get old, they say they fear being alone," I whispered. "But I've learned something worse. The real fear isn't loneliness. It's realizing the child you brought into this world has become an accomplice to the person who once destroyed you." Patrick didn't say anything. He sat across from me, shoulders slumped, eyes filled with pity that I didn't want. I wiped my tears, though the ache in my chest didn't lessen. "He used to forge my signature on tax forms," I said, my fingers tracing the old, familiar curve of Austin's handwriting. "I thought that was the worst betrayal a man could commit. But this, using our son, turning him into a pawn in his fraud, it's beyond betrayal." My hands trembled slightly as I straightened the papers on the table. The sound of rain against the window grew heavier, echoing in the silence between us. I could almost feel Austin's presence again, like a shadow creeping through the room, smiling, confident, manipulative. For 30 years I had buried that ghost. But now he was back alive in every transaction, every forged document, every decision my son had made under his influence. I looked up at Patrick. My tears had dried, replaced by something sharper, a cold, deliberate resolve. "If you help me expose him," I said quietly, "I swear I won't stop until no one else gets hurt because of him." Patrick nodded slowly. "You have my word." I gathered the documents into a neat stack, aligning each corner the way I used to prepare medical charts before surgery. Outside, thunder rolled through the night. I wasn't just a mother grieving anymore. I was a woman reclaiming her fight. Austin had started this decades ago, but I would be the one to finish it. I sat at Cameron Ellis' cluttered desk while he pinned map printouts and bank ledgers to the wall, like a surgeon arranging instruments. He called it a financial caseboard, and he moved through the evidence with the same focused calm I once used in an emergency room. Cameron had pulled records from FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and run them through patterns only someone who had lived inside fraud investigations could see. He circled accounts that sent money across state lines in ways that made no business sense. He marked timestamps that lined up with the withdrawals we had already found. The paper looked chaotic, but to him, it was logic and anatomy of theft. Patrick sat by the window, hands curled around a mug, quieter than I had ever seen him. He had once worked in computing, and his skill showed. He traced IP addresses from leaked emails and crypto transaction logs the way I used to trace heart murmurs. The trail led back to a single server cluster hosted in Miami, the same city where Austin Nolan had kept an apartment when he was younger. Patrick explained each hop without flourish, mapping out how emails were relayed through proxies, how wallet addresses branched like tributaries into anonymous chains. The technical language might have been foreign to me a year ago, but the pattern felt visceral, like reading an ECG and knowing which beat was wrong. We set rules from the start. No warnings to Matthew or Lauren. No stunt that would burn our chances to gather federal-grade proof. Cameron insisted that only a federal probe could freeze assets cleanly and make subpoenas stick. Patrick agreed, adding that Austin was expert at erasing traces for anyone who moved too hastily. I listened and felt old instincts stir the ones that kept hands calm and minds sharp during long nights in hospital. This was investigation, not revenge. We needed evidence that would make agents act. I took one of Cameron's small suggestions and became a quiet test. I opened a bank account under a false name, funded it with $1,000, and gave the money to A. Nolan Investments, in the same way other victims had been persuaded to invest. It felt absurd and intimate at once, like performing a minor surgery on myself to understand the wound. I watched the blockchain as Patrick and Cameron watched with me. The transfer moved through a chain of wallets and then split. And at the end of that split, I saw a wallet that matched the one Matthew had used to receive payments. The proof was not only numerical, it was a chain tied by timestamps, IP routes, and corporate shell paperwork that linked A. Nolan Holdings to Donovan Consulting to the anonymous crypto trail. When I looked up from the glowing screen, I felt something cold and steady inside. We had built a map that federal investigators could walk into and not get lost. We had agreed to wait to collate to protect. The rule hung in the room like an instruction etched into bone. When the FBI moves, no one can erase the trail. Until then, we would watch and collect and not speak the names aloud. When Cameron called me into his office that morning, I could tell by his face that something big had surfaced. His desk was covered with printouts and legal filings, each stamped with the seal of the Florida Secretary of State. He slid a sheet toward me and said quietly, "We found him." At the top of the document was the name A. Nolan Holdings, LLC, registered under someone named Anthony Reed. The address, though, stopped me cold. It was the same P.O. box in Miami that Austin used to rent 30 years ago, back when he was still pretending to be a legitimate financial consultant. I could almost see him again, his expensive suit, his confident grin, his ability to make people trust him even as he picked their pockets. Only this time he wasn't just stealing from strangers. He was using our son and daughter-in-law to do it. Cameron tapped his pen on the paper. "Reed doesn't exist," he said. "The Social Security number belongs to a dead man from New Jersey. Everything about this registration is a shell." Patrick joined us later that day, bringing a flash drive filled with recovered emails. He had managed to hack into an archived inbox from one of Austin's defunct domains. The emails looked legitimate, at first routine business correspondence, investment proposals, client updates, but the signatures told a different story. Lauren's name appeared beneath the title Executive Assistant and Matthew's under Operations Manager. My heart clenched as I scrolled through the messages. My son, my boy, who once dreamed of starting an honest tech firm, now writing things like "funds have cleared. Proceed with next cycle." There were no tax ID numbers, no registration with FINRA or the SEC, nothing that suggested legal financial operations. Just digital ghosts moving stolen money from one pocket to another. Cameron leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "This isn't just fraud," he said slowly. "This is a family-run Ponzi scheme. Austin set it up. Lauren handles the communications, and Matthew manages the logistics." He pointed at a section in one of the documents. "If we can prove the investors include seniors or retirees, it qualifies as elder financial exploitation. Combined with interstate wire fraud and tax evasion, we're looking at multiple federal counts." I stared at the computer screen, feeling my stomach twist. Each file, each forged document, was another fracture in the life I once knew. The same man who abandoned me decades ago had rebuilt his empire of deceit, and this time he had done it with my child's hands. Cameron's voice broke through my thoughts. "Rachel, once we have enough evidence, the FBI can freeze every account. But we need to move carefully. Austin's smart, and he knows how to vanish." I nodded, my voice steady, despite the ache inside me. "Then we'll move smarter. He might have taught my son how to hide money, but he forgot I was the one who taught Matthew how to think." Patrick handed me the printout without saying a word. The paper trembled slightly between his fingers, and for a second, I thought it was just the wind from the window. But no, it was his hands. When I looked down and saw the subject line "Private Loan Agreement, Family Trust," I understood why. $80,000. Signed by Austin Nolan. Recipient Lauren Donovan. The contract was cold, efficient, and dressed in the sterile language of legality. A father funding his daughter-in-law. But the reason written beneath it twisted my stomach: medical assistance, fertility process. I kept reading, my eyes stinging, as if the ink itself burned. At the bottom of the page, under a shaded section, labeled "Special Conditions," there was a single sentence: "All communication with Rachel Nolan must cease permanently upon payment." My throat tightened. I could feel the blood pulsing in my ears, each beat louder than the last. So this was it. The truth, behind the silence, behind the unanswered calls, behind the little boy I had never held. My grandson Brandon wasn't a miracle of love. He was a transaction. Patrick's voice broke the silence, gentle but heavy. "He paid for the procedure, Rachel, the IVF. It wasn't just generosity. He used the money to control them, to buy your absence." I sat down slowly because my legs no longer felt steady. The paper in my hand shook, but my voice didn't knot this time. It came out low, deliberate, like someone forcing herself to breathe through pain. So the child I waited for, the one I dreamed of holding, wasn't born out of hope. He was born out of a deal. The words tasted like ash. I remembered the small gifts I had prepared before their disappearance: the knitted blanket, the silver rattle with Brandon's initials engraved before I even knew if he existed. I thought those things would one day become symbols of family. Now they were relics of a lie. Cameron looked at me with quiet sympathy, but I didn't want sympathy. I wanted justice. "Austin didn't just steal money," I said. "He stole meaning. He turned life itself into a contract. For a long time, none of us spoke. The only sound was the slow tick of Cameron's office clock, each second reminding me how deep betrayal can run when it's written in legal ink. I stared at the last page of the contract again, the elegant slanted signature I once knew so well. The man who once promised to build a family with me had instead purchased one through deceit. My tears fell silently onto the paper, smudging his name. But through that blur, a thought hardened inside me. He had turned my family into business, and I would make sure he paid for every cent of it. I spent the next week like a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation, careful, focused, methodical. I gathered every scrap that might be proof and laid it out on the dining table, treating each sheet with the respect I used to give patient charts. Bank statements printed with highlighted lines, withdrawal receipts with stamp marks, email threads printed in chronological order until the paper ran out, a copy of the birth certificate with the name that was not his true name. Each item felt heavier than the last because every one of them proved that my family had been turned into a ledger. Patrick proved to be more resourceful than I expected. He had once given Lauren a tablet for her birthday, the kind of generous, slightly awkward gift a stepfather might give. He told me later that he had set up the device with a legitimate location, sharing feature something marketed to families to keep each other safe. It felt invasive at first when he explained it, but when he pulled up the footage, I did not hesitate. On a rainy Tuesday, he connected the tablet to his laptop and exported a video clip. There she was in her apartment, fingers moving with the slow certainty of someone who has done this many times. She unlocked the device, opened a browser, logged into a crypto wallet, copied the receiving address, and then confirmed a transfer. The clip was grainy, ordinary, and devastating. Watching it, I felt the old clinical calm come back, the part of me that analyzes to prevent being ruined by emotion. This was evidence. This was truth. I organized everything into a red binder and labeled it Case Nolan. I printed a table of contents, dated each page, and added a handwritten note with the timestamps. I arranged the financial records first, then the email prints, then the video printouts with timecode notations, and finally the birth certificate and the private loan agreement. I stapled receipts into envelopes and taped them to the relevant pages. For days, I moved around that binder as if it were an organ I had to protect. Cameron taught me about chain of custody, which sounded dry until he explained the stakes. He showed me how to create a sworn statement of collection, how to record hashes of the video files so that their integrity could be proven, how to log each copy and where it went. He explained that the FBI needed original timestamps and unbroken metadata to accept digital evidence. So I bought a new external hard drive, had Patrick copy raw video files to it, and then took the drive to a notary who watched me sign a declaration and sealed the drive in a tamper-evident bag. Cameron printed a short affidavit for me to sign, and I did so with hands that did not quite steady. There was a private moment in all of that paperwork when I sat with a pen and wrote on the cover of the binder a sentence that felt like both a warning and a promise. If truth can hurt, let it hurt loudly. Seeing those words in my own hand steadied something inside me. It became less about revenge and more about correcting an injustice. I felt like a doctor again, assembling evidence to treat a disease. Only this disease had been allowed to fester because too many people had trusted a charming liar. We had the documents, the video, and the legal steps ready. Now we had to be patient and precise, because once we presented the case in a way the authorities could use, the lie would have to answer for itself. Cameron worked with the same precision I used to bring to the operating room. He spent days preparing the complaint, cross-referencing each document, and writing the legal summary in a language that sounded like both a confession and a declaration of war. I watched him assemble the packet cover letter exhibits, chain of custody forms, financial logs, and slide them into a thick envelope stamped Suspicious Activity Report SAR. He filed it first with the FBI field office in Cleveland, our home ground, then sent a certified copy to the Attorney General's office of North Carolina, since much of the financial traffic passed through Raleigh and Charlotte. His report was clinical relentless. It detailed Austin's old bankruptcy fraud case from the 1990s, the fake identity of Anthony Reed, the shell company, A. Nolan Holdings, LLC, and the two employees who shared his blood, Matthew and Lauren. Cameron looked at me before hitting send on the digital submission. "Once this goes in," he said quietly, "we don't own the timeline anymore. The Bureau does." 3 weeks later, the response came in an email with an official letterhead and an attached request for evidence. The FBI had assigned a case number and would proceed under 18 U.S. Code 1343 wire fraud. They asked me to confirm the authenticity of the binder I'd assembled and to supply certified copies of the crypto transactions and the surveillance footage Patrick had captured. Reading those words, federal investigation, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, not victory, but a kind of grounded strength, like a pulse returning after too much silence. That night, the three of us sat in Cameron's car, parked on the overlook by the highway. The city lights flickered on the windshield like restless stars. Patrick sat in the back seat silent, his eyes fixed on the traffic below. Cameron kept the engine idling, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other on the thick file now labeled Case Nolan, Federal. I looked out through the glass, watching the endless stream of headlights, lives moving forward, unaware of the quiet battle unfolding in one parked car. I took a slow breath and said almost to myself, I used to save lives with a stethoscope. My voice trembled, then steadied. Now I'll save my own family with justice. Cameron gave a small nod. Patrick turned toward me, the reflection of the dashboard light in his eyes. For the first time in months, I felt something that resembled peace. The investigation had begun. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper coffee and rain. I had been in operating rooms that felt less tense than that courtroom. When the marshals led Austin in, I could hear the shutters clicking from the press section. He was thinner than I remembered his once slick hair, now gray and uneven, but the arrogance, God, that arrogance was untouched. He walked as if he were the only one who still believed in his own myth. His wrists were cuffed, but his chin stayed high, that same old smirk, curving his mouth as if the whole thing were beneath him. Lauren and Matthew followed a few steps behind, both pale and silent. Lauren avoided my eyes, completely clutching a tissue like it could erase the shame. Matthew's gaze flicked toward me for a second, and in that brief glance, I saw something guilt-fear, or maybe the final recognition of how far he had fallen. Then he looked down, and I knew I had lost the son I raised to the man his father created. Reporters lined the hallway, cameras flashing as we entered. The headlines hit every screen before the hearing even began. Doctor's family involved in fraud ring. My name appeared in bold letters across the lower third of the news broadcast. Former physician Rachel Nolan arrives at court calm amid chaos. Calm, that's what they called it. But inside my heart was a clenched fist. Through the glass doors, I could see people whispering in the lobby, some I recognized from the hospital where I used to work. I caught fragments of their voices. She was one of the best doctors in Cleveland. Can you believe her husband was behind a Ponzi scheme? Every word was a needle, but I didn't flinch. I had already lived through the worst part, the betrayal. This was only the surgery to remove what was rotten. I sat quietly in the second row of the courtroom, the wooden bench cold under my hands. Between my fingers, I held a small wooden rosary, something Austin had given me decades ago, when he was still pretending to be a man of faith. I rolled the beads one by one, feeling the smoothness worn by years, a symbol of what used to be love, now reduced to evidence of how blind I once was. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The clerk read the charges: multiple counts of wire fraud conspiracy and elder financial exploitation. Each word echoed like a diagnosis in a room full of witnesses. Austin's lawyer tried to object to claim business miscommunication, but the prosecutors were armed with the evidence we had built: the red binder, the video, the transactions. Cameron sat at the front, focused and steady, while Patrick avoided my eyes, hands clasped tightly on his lap. I didn't speak that day. I didn't need to. The truth was finally loud enough without me. When the bailiff called my name, I rose slowly, smoothing the front of my gray suit. The courtroom fell quiet, in that strange way rooms do when something fragile is about to happen. I walked to the witness stand with measured steps, feeling the solid floor beneath me, every step a reminder that this moment was real. The prosecutor greeted me politely, guiding me through the oath. My voice was steady as I swore to tell the truth. For years I had spoken to patients with the same calm tone. Now it was my own life I was dissecting. Dr. Nolan, the prosecutor, began. "What is your relationship to the defendant, Austin Nolan?" I looked toward Austin, who sat behind his lawyer's expression, unreadable. "I was his wife," I said clearly. "But today I am only a woman who wants justice to be served." The sentence seemed to settle into the air like dust. The jurors' eyes followed me, curious, cautious, sympathetic. I continued recounting the timeline: when communication with my son stopped, when the bank statements no longer matched, when the money vanished, and the silence grew louder. I explained how I had worked with two men, one a lawyer, one a broken stepfather, to uncover the truth behind a network of fraud that stretched across states. The prosecutor showed the red binder we had built page by page, our late nights turned into evidence. He asked how I found the strength to investigate my own family. I took a breath before answering. When I was still a doctor, I said softly, I believed that healing meant saving lives. But sometimes healing means confronting the disease even if it's in your own home. There was a stillness in the room. No cough, no shuffle of papers. Even the judge watched me without interruption. I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears as I spoke the line that had been sitting in my chest for weeks. I used to heal others, I said, my voice clear and deliberate. But today I must perform surgery on my own family, cutting out the tumor named deceit. For a moment, the words just hung there, sharp and quiet. Then the prosecutor nodded, his expression softening. Across the room, a few members of the jury exchanged glances, some swallowing hard. I saw Cameron's faint smile, Patrick's eyes glistening. Even Lauren's composure cracked. Her hands trembled in her lap. The judge thanked me and signaled for me to step down. As I walked back to my seat, I didn't feel broken. I felt clean, as if years of silence had finally been lanced open. Cameron stood before the courtroom, his calm voice carrying the weight of months of preparation. On the screen behind him glowed a digital map, dozens of red lines connecting account after account numbers and arrows pulsing like veins in a body riddled with disease. This, he said, gesturing with a laser pointer, is the flow of money over $2 million, routed through 17 intermediary accounts, each one eventually leading back to one destination: the cryptocurrency wallet belonging to Austin Nolan. The jurors leaned forward. Even the judge adjusted his glasses. The pattern was undeniable, the web intricate but traceable. I watched from the second row, my hands clasped tight around the small wooden rosary in my lap. I had stared at those same figures in Cameron's office weeks ago, but seeing them now displayed in front of strangers turned private grief into public truth. Patrick followed, holding a flash drive like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Your Honor," He said this video was extracted from a tablet belonging to Lauren Donovan, recorded through a lawful monitoring feature. He pressed play, and the room went utterly still. On the screen, the footage showed Austin in a video call, his voice calm, commanding. "Sign on the bottom line, Matthew," he said, tapping the camera with his finger. "It's just a transfer authorization. No one will trace it." Then Matthew appeared in frame, sitting at a kitchen table. His shoulders were tense, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure this is legal, Dad?" Austin's reply was cold. Legal enough. The next moment, everyone in the courtroom saw it. Matthew signing his name on the fake investment contract, the digital pen looping across the tablet screen. The prosecutor turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are witnessing the act that made this fraud possible. That is Matthew Nolan's signature under his father's direction." The air in the room thickened. Matthew sat motionless at the defense table, head bowed so low his chin nearly touched his chest. His silence said more than any denial ever could. FBI agents in the witness stand confirmed the final piece. They had traced Austin's crypto accounts and verified that they were classified as high-risk flagged entities, a designation reserved for international laundering operations. Combined with the digital transactions and the recorded instructions, the evidence established interstate wire fraud and money laundering beyond reasonable doubt. Cameron concluded with the precision of a surgeon closing an incision. "The evidence forms a perfect loop," he said. "Every dollar left a fingerprint, and every fingerprint leads back to Austin Nolan." In that moment, I felt something in me loosen. Not joy, not even relief, but the slow, painful release of truth, finally standing on its own. Lauren sat trembling in the witness chair, her hands twisting a damp tissue until it nearly tore apart. The courtroom was silent, except for her unsteady breathing and the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. Her voice cracked as she began to speak, each word pulled from somewhere deep between guilt and fear. "He promised us money," she said. "A trust fund, $250,000 if we agreed to remove Rachel from our lives." The prosecutor leaned forward. "Remove her? How, Mrs. Nolan?" Lauren's mascara had already streaked down her cheeks. "Not hurt her," she said quickly, shaking her head. "He just said we had to cut her off. No calls, no letters, no visits. He said she was a liability, that she'd ruin the financial plan he was building. He made it sound like it was for Matthew's protection." I sat behind her, my fingers tightening around the wooden rosary in my hand. Liability. That was the word he used for me. A woman who once shared his home, his name, his child, now reduced to a threat in his empire of deceit. Lauren wiped her face and continued, her voice small, broken. "He told me if I wanted a child through IVF, he would cover every expense. He said it was a gift for the family's future. I just had to sign. I thought I was doing something good for my husband, for our baby. I didn't realize I was signing into sin." The courtroom stayed silent. Even the reporters had stopped typing. I could feel every eye shifting between her and me, between the woman who bore my grandchild and the mother who had been erased for the sake of money. Then Matthew spoke. His voice hoarse, his body hunched forward like the weight of his choices was crushing him. "I knew," he said quietly. "I knew it was my father. I recognized his voice on those calls. But I told myself if I just stayed quiet, it would all go away. I thought silence would protect us." His voice broke completely. "But silence killed everything. It killed our family." He covered his face with his hands, and for a long moment, no one moved. The judge didn't speak. The jurors didn't blink. It was as if the air itself was mourning. I didn't cry. I couldn't. My tears had dried long before this day. But inside me, something steadier rose, the clarity of truth laid bare. They had been bought, deceived, manipulated. Yet here in front of the law, Their confessions had finally freed me from the weight of wondering. For the older people in that room, I could feel it, the ache of recognition. The pain of watching children blinded by greed, the sorrow of mothers who stayed clear-eyed when everyone else lost their way. The courtroom was silent when the judge returned with the verdict. I could hear the rustle of papers, the shuffle of shoes, and somewhere in the back, the faint click of a reporter's pen. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation, and the scent of rain from the open windows. Then the judge spoke, his voice steady, deliberate, and final. In the case of United States versus Austin Nolan, the court finds the defendant guilty of financial fraud and money laundering. The sentence is 20 years in federal prison. There was no outburst, no gasp, just the quiet hum of realization. Austin didn't flinch. He stood there, hands clasped in front of him, the faintest smirk curling on his lips, as if even prison couldn't touch the ego he had built. The judge continued, turning to the next line of names. Lauren Donovan Nolan and Matthew Nolan. This court grants a suspended sentence of 5 years probation, conditional upon the repayment of $400,000 to the victims of this crime. Lauren broke down, sobbing into her hands. Matthew stared straight ahead, face pale and expression hollow, as though his punishment had already begun long before the sentence was spoken. But it was the next words that made the room shift, the line that drew every eye toward me. Regarding the minor Brandon Nolan, custody is hereby granted temporarily to his grandmother, Dr. Rachel Nolan, in order to ensure a stable and secure environment for the child. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. The words echoed through me, simple and powerful: custody granted. After everything, years of betrayal, months of investigation, nights spent sleepless with doubt, I was no longer the woman erased. I was the guardian. As the guards moved to escort Austin out, he turned his head toward me, his cuffed hands tightening behind his back. "You won this time," he said, his voice low but sharp. "But this family will never know peace." I looked straight into his eyes, my voice calm. "I'm not looking for peace," I said. "I'm looking for justice." He sneered, then looked away as they led him through the side door. The courtroom buzzed again, the scrape of chairs, the soft murmurs of journalists already preparing their headlines. By evening, the story was everywhere. The Cleveland Gazette ran the headline, "The Nolan Case, A Mother's Fight for Truth." On local television, they showed a brief clip of me leaving the courthouse, the rain falling lightly, as I held my umbrella and walked past the cameras. Reporters called me a symbol of quiet courage, of the women who refused to stay silent when betrayal came from within their own homes. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt tired, human, and painfully alive. But for the first time in years, I also felt free. The house felt different when I returned, quieter, softer, almost as if it too had survived something. The walls that once echoed with loneliness now carried the gentle rhythm of a baby's laughter. Brandon's crib sat in the corner of the living room, where I used to keep my medical journals. Each morning, I warmed his milk-hummed old lullabies and whispered promises I had never been given the chance to keep. In that tiny heartbeat, I found the kind of peace that no verdict could deliver. The court had officially granted me temporary custody of my grandson, but to me, it felt like more than a legal victory. It was redemption. I fed him, rocked him to sleep, and sometimes when the night grew too still, I'd catch myself murmuring to him, "You will never grow up in lies. Not while I'm here." One afternoon, a letter arrived from the correctional facility. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakable Matthew's. "Mom," it began. "I was lost. I thought I was building a future, but I was only rebuilding the same lie Dad taught me. I see it now, that family wasn't real. It was a performance, and I played my part too well. I'm sorry." I read the letter twice, maybe 3 times, before folding it neatly and placing it beside Brandon's crib. I didn't cry. I simply closed my eyes and said a quiet prayer that my son would one day find the courage to rebuild something true. Lauren's fall came quietly, but completely. The bank revoked her license, the financial industry blacklisted her, and she moved out of state stripped of the privilege she once wore like perfume. The last I heard, she was living with her sister, working at a local daycare. I didn't hate her. I just hoped the children's laughter around her would remind her of the one she had tried to erase. Patrick stayed. He became a constant, fixing the old mailbox, bringing groceries, sometimes just sitting with me on the porch without saying much. Two people bound not by romance, but by the shared understanding of surviving betrayal. On some evenings, we'd share coffee while watching the sunset over the Cleveland skyline. He'd smile faintly and say, "You got your family back, Rachel." I'd answer, "Not the same one, but the right one." The news channels replayed the sentencing for weeks. Austin Nolan receives 20 years in federal prison. I saw the footage once, the moment he finally broke his posture, collapsing as the sentence was read. The caption underneath read, "The man who once walked away now falls before the woman who never gave up." I turned off the TV, looked down at Brandon sleeping on my chest, and whispered the only truth I'd earned through every wound and every loss. Old age isn't weakness. It's the clarity earned from every betrayal. The morning light spilled softly across the quiet street, turning every leaf gold. I pushed Brandon's stroller along the sidewalk, his small hands reaching for the sunlight that flickered through the trees. Beside me, Patrick walked in comfortable silence, holding a cup of coffee, the warmth of it rising like steam between us. Across the street, Cameron waved from his car window before driving toward the courthouse, the same building where months ago everything had changed. Now, for the first time in years, the world didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a beginning. Back home, after putting Brandon down for his nap, I opened my old leather journal, the one that had followed me through every storm. My handwriting looked different now, calmer somehow. I wrote slowly, letting each word settle. I once lost a family to deceit, but I found a true one again through courage. The ink spread slightly, soaking into the paper, permanent and quiet. It wasn't bitterness I felt anymore, just clarity, the kind that comes when you've already survived the worst. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, painting soft shadows across the floor. I watched Brandon sleeping, one hand curled beside his cheek, and thought of all the nights I had prayed simply to keep breathing. The journey had taken everything trust, pride, years, but had given me something I never expected: peace. When the sun began to dip, I stood by the doorway, holding the small photograph I'd taken of Brandon a week earlier, his first real smile. I locked the front door, slipped the photo into my pocket, and stepped outside. The air was cool, the sky pale blue. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime rang gently like an answer. As I looked up at the sky, I whispered to myself, "Not every wound needs medicine. Some only need time and justice." It wasn't just a thought. It was the truth I had earned. Justice had not erased the pain, but it had given the pain meaning. I smiled, then a quiet, knowing smile, the kind that comes when you've finally made peace with the scars. For every woman who's been betrayed, for every mother who's been silenced, I hope my story finds its way to you. Don't stay quiet. Tell your truth. Because sometimes justice begins with one mother who refuses to bow.